The Black Death, also known as the bubonic plague, was one of the most devastating pandemics in human history. It swept through Europe, Asia, and Africa in the 14th century, killing millions and altering the course of history. This article delves into the origins, spread, impact, and long-term consequences of the Black Death, exploring how this catastrophic event reshaped societies and influenced future generations. The Black Death is believed to have originated in the arid plains of Central Asia, possibly near China or Mongolia, in the early 14th century. The disease was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, which primarily infected rodents and was transmitted to humans through the bites of infected fleas. These fleas thrived on black rats, common inhabitants of human settlements. The plague likely spread along the Silk Road, a network of trade routes connecting the East and West, facilitated by the movement of armies, merchants, and travelers. By the early 1340s, it had reached the Crimea, a peninsula on the northern coast of the Black Sea, which served as a major trade hub. From Crimea, the plague spread rapidly across Europe. In 1347, trading ships carrying infected rats arrived in the ports of Sicily, marking the beginning of the pandemic in Europe. From there, it spread quickly through Italy, reaching the major trading centers of Venice, Genoa, and Florence. By 1348, the plague had reached France, Spain, England, and the rest of Western Europe. The spread of the Black Death was facilitated by several factors. Trade routes and the movement of armies allowed for rapid transmission across vast distances. Urban areas, with their dense populations and poor sanitation, provided ideal conditions for the disease to thrive. Additionally, a lack of medical knowledge and effective treatments meant that once the plague took hold in a community, it could spread unchecked. The Black Death manifested in three forms: bubonic, septicemic, and pneumonic. The most common form, bubonic plague, was characterized by the sudden onset of fever, chills, headache, and swollen lymph nodes, called buboes, which were often painful and could become suppurative. Septicemic plague occurred when the infection spread to the bloodstream, leading to severe sepsis and rapid death. Pneumonic plague, the most virulent form, affected the lungs and could be transmitted through respiratory droplets, making it highly contagious. Symptoms typically appeared within a few days of exposure, and death often followed within a week. The mortality rate for untreated bubonic plague was around 60 to 70%, while septicemic and pneumonic forms had even higher fatality rates. The Black Death had a profound impact on European society, economy, and culture. The population decline was catastrophic, with estimates suggesting that between 25% and 60% of Europe's population perished within a few years. Cities were particularly hard hit, with some losing up to 80% of their inhabitants. The massive loss of life led to labor shortages, which had significant economic consequences. Wages rose as workers became scarce, and the feudal system began to weaken as serfs and peasants demanded better conditions and pay. This shift contributed to the eventual decline of feudalism and the rise of a more market-oriented economy. The psychological impact of the Black Death was also profound. The sheer scale of death and suffering led to widespread fear, despair, and a sense of helplessness. Many people turned to religion for solace, while others engaged in hedonistic behaviors, believing that death was inevitable. The flagellant movement, where groups of people would publicly whip themselves as penance for humanity's sins, gained popularity during this time. Responses to the Black Death varied widely. In many areas, people sought to blame minority groups, particularly Jews, who were often scapegoated for causing the plague through alleged poisoning of wells or other means. This led to violent pogroms and the massacre of Jewish communities across Europe. Authorities implemented various measures to try to control the spread of the disease. Quarantine practices were established, with infected households and individuals isolated from the rest of the population. In some cities, entire neighborhoods were cordoned off, and ships arriving from plague-infected areas were held in quarantine for weeks before being allowed to dock. Medical practices of the time were largely ineffective against the plague. Physicians relied on treatments such as bloodletting, applying poultices to buboes, and the use of herbal remedies. These treatments were based on the prevailing medical theories of the time, which attributed disease to imbalances in the body's humors or to miasma or bad air. The Black Death had far-reaching consequences that extended well beyond the immediate impact of the pandemic. One of the most significant long-term effects was the dramatic reduction in population, which altered the demographic and economic landscape of Europe. The labor shortages led to higher wages and better living conditions for survivors, contributing to the eventual decline of the feudal system. The plague also had a profound impact on art and culture. The pervasive presence of death and suffering led to a preoccupation with mortality in art and literature. The danse macabre, or dance of death, became a common motif, depicting the universality of death and its inevitability for all social classes. The religious impact of the Black Death was also significant. The inability of the Church to provide effective relief or explanations for the plague led to a decline in its authority and influence. This disillusionment with the Church set the stage for the religious upheavals of the Reformation in the 16th century. The Black Death spurred advancements in medical and scientific understanding, albeit slowly. The sheer scale of the pandemic highlighted the limitations of contemporary medical knowledge and practices, leading to increased interest in medical research and public health measures. The study of the plague and its transmission eventually contributed to the development of modern epidemiology and the understanding of infectious diseases. It wasn't until the late 19th century that Yersinia pestis was identified as the causative agent of the plague, and the role of fleas and rats in its transmission was understood.